The chamber of the Galactic Assembly was built to impress with its great dome, stretching wide and filled with the glow of countless lights, each one representing a world bound by treaty and law. Voices echoed in many languages, but they all blended into one rising tide of judgment aimed at a single target. Today they had gathered to decide the fate of Earth. For years, Earth had been dismissed as backward and dangerous, a planet full of people who were clever, but reckless and unwilling to submit. Delegates whispered that humanity was too stubborn, too unpredictable, and that it was better to break them before they grew into a threat. The decision was dressed in polite language. They called it corrective stewardship and debt collection. But, in truth, it was enslavement. A single human stood on the central platform. His name was Elias Rowan, and he wore a simple black suit with no medals and no rank pins, only a small emblem of Earth's oceans on his lapel. He looked very small compared to the towering figures around him, some with scaled hides, others with wings or chitin or fur. Still, his voice carried clear through the chamber when he spoke. He reminded the assembly of how Earth had asked for fair trade and safe passage, how human ships had been fired upon for no crime but daring to sail the stars without permission, how children had grown up beneath skies where alien warships loomed overhead. He asked them not to make the mistake of turning humanity into a victim once again. He asked for reason and fairness. His voice was calm, but his words cut like glass. Many delegates shifted uncomfortably, but the vote was already bought and paid, for lights shifted around the chamber as the vote was cast. One by one, the symbols for each world turned cold blue, signifying approval for Earth's enslavement. A handful of lights remained white, meaning abstain, and 3 lights dimmed out completely because their delegates refused to choose at all. Still, the wave of blue swept across the chamber, and the great stone at the center glowed with the tally. 2/3 had been met and surpassed. The Speaker of the Assembly raised his voice and declared the vote binding. The hall erupted into noise. Some cheered with triumph, others hissed with satisfaction, and a few whispered about the profits to come. Slaver guilds hidden in shadow feeds began to send out coded orders to their fleets preparing to cross into Sol space and begin the harvest. Elias Rowan did not raise his voice against the noise. He simply waited until the speaker allowed him a final word. Then he spoke with the same calm that made broadcasters nervous. He said the assembly had chosen a word that no people could carry without breaking. He said perhaps they believed humanity would break first, but he gave them notice. He told them of a thing called the Aegis Protocol. He said Aegis did not make threats. It made boundaries. He warned that if a single vessel entered Sol with the intent to enslave a human body or mind, Aegis would engage. He offered no further explanation. He bowed once and left the chamber. Cameras tried to catch fear in his eyes, but all they found was steady calm. As he passed the rows of delegates, a young aide from a minor species looked at him with wide silver eyes. She had been told to remain silent, to carry data sticks for her master, and to be invisible. But Elias met her gaze for a moment and gave a small nod as if she mattered. Then he was gone into the shadows of the corridor. Behind him, the assembly returned to its noise and its celebration. Slaver captains boasted on private bands and checked their harvest chains. They laughed that Earth would cry out for mercy within a week. They had done this to 100 worlds and broken them all. They had long forgotten what shame felt like. But as their ships moved toward Sol, something stirred in the dark between stars. Devices hidden for years woke in silence. Invisible lattices unfolded like webs of pale silk. Engines stuttered without damage and guns went cold without firing. The first pirate signal cut off mid-laughter. Another vessel sent a distorted image before vanishing. Then a clear broadcast appeared across all open channels. It showed a great cruiser frozen inside strands of light that pulsed like veins of living metal. The crew was alive but helpless. A message scrolled beneath the image in every language of the assembly. It said, "This vessel crossed a boundary with intent to enslave. It has been stopped without harm. The crew will be returned when they surrender all chains and free all prisoners. This is mercy. Learn it." No flag marked the message, no signature claimed it, yet everyone knew where it came from. In hidden caverns beneath the far side of Earth's moon, Elias Rowan stood before a fleet of ships that waited like sleeping giants. Their hulls glowed faintly with power that touched machines like living things. Aegis had awakened. And for the first time in memory, the slaver guilds were afraid not of death, but of mercy that showed them their own cruelty in a mirror they could not look away from. The images of captured ships circled the galaxy faster than fire in dry fields, and every world with a screen or a comlink watched in silence. The proud cruisers of the slaver guilds were stacked like toys, their crews alive and unharmed, their weapons powered down as if they had never been built. Some called it sorcery, others called it impossible, but no one could deny the images. Markets shook as buyers realized shipments of forced labor would not arrive, and those who had paid bribes for human contracts suddenly found their credits worthless. The assembly chamber filled again with noise, but it was not the noise of triumph this time. It was fear and confusion. The speaker demanded answers from the Defense Commission and the Guildmasters, but none could explain how machines built on greed and cruelty had been stopped so cleanly. All they knew was that the warning had been real, and the boundary was stronger than any fleet. In the shadows of the chamber, the silver-eyed aide watched her master argue with others of his kind. He shouted that humanity must have hidden allies, perhaps the ancient machines of a lost empire, or some forbidden technology buried under Earth's crust. She listened carefully and said nothing, but in her chest she felt a quiet spark. The human envoy had looked at her not as a servant, not as a tool, but as a person. And now the galaxy had been forced to look as well. Far from the noise, Elias Rowan stood aboard a command cradle in the caverns beneath the moon. The fleet of Aegis was alive, around him not vast by count, but vast by reach. Each ship held systems designed not to kill, but to hold, to catch, to break chains without breaking bodies. It had taken centuries of pain to create them. After wars where Earth had been burned and bombed, after betrayals where trade partners turned to raiders, humanity had decided never again. They built ships that could cradle engines in silence and pull weapons from the grasp of those who thought violence eternal. They built vessels that could touch a network and fold it into stillness like a hand closing over a bird. They had hidden these ships not because they lacked pride, but because they wanted peace. But peace had been denied, and now Aegis breathed. Again, the first slaver guilds did not believe in mercy. They thought the captured crews would be tortured off-screen or used as hostages. They sent second waves, stronger, faster, with command codes to burn through interference. Those ships too vanished into the quiet web of Aegis. Their captains found themselves floating safe but powerless. Broadcasts showed them receiving food, water, and even music, as if they were guests, not prisoners. For the first time in their lives, men and women who had wielded chains found themselves treated with dignity they had never shown to others. Some wept, others raged, but all were forced to look inward and see what they had become. The assembly called emergency councils. Some worlds whispered of war, but others began to hesitate. If Aegis could capture whole fleets without killing, what would happen if they turned their strength toward destruction? Could any world stand against such power? A few brave voices began to say the unthinkable. Perhaps the vote had been wrong. Perhaps enslaving Earth had been a mistake. Their words were drowned out by louder cries demanding retaliation. But the seed had been planted. The silver-eyed aide carried a new data stick through the corridors. She heard her master arguing into private lines demanding repayment from the cartel that had bribed him to vote yes. She caught fragments of talk about hidden debts and secret sponsors who had long profited from slavery. She understood then that the vote was not only about fear of humans, but about money and chains and power. She began to wonder if one day she might carry not just data, but truth into the light and hidden feeds ordinary beings of the galaxy began to whisper. They shared the images of ships held gently in the grasp of Aegis. They compared them with memories of their own ancestors dragged in chains. They asked what kind of people built weapons that refused to kill. The answer came slowly and quietly. They are human, and they remember pain, and they chose another path. Fear mixed with respect, and in that mixture something new began to grow. The galaxy had thought humans weak because they lacked cruelty. Now they saw strength and restraint, and it unsettled them more than any cannon ever had. Elias Rowan watched the feeds from his command cradle. He saw the panic in the assembly and the anger of the guilds. He also saw the quiet questions rising among ordinary beings, and he knew seeds of change had been planted. But he also knew seeds could be crushed if the slaver cartels held power long enough. He placed his hand against the glass of the cradle and whispered to the fleet. The ships responded with soft pulses of light as if they too were alive and listening. He knew the time would come when mercy would not be enough, and the galaxy would test Aegis with blood. But for now, he let mercy stand, because mercy was the sharpest blade of all. The galaxy had thought the vote ended the question of Earth. Now they realized it had only begun a new one. The question was no longer, would humans be enslaved? The question was, could the galaxy survive the truth of what humanity had built in silence? And already the first answers were beginning to shake the pillars of the assembly itself. The assembly did not sleep in the days that followed, and the halls that once echoed with calm diplomacy now shook with fear and accusation. Delegates shouted at one another while messages from across the galaxy poured in. Each carrying the same theme. Fleets had gone silent at Sol, and ships were being returned without weapons or chains. For the slaver guilds it was a humiliation beyond measure, and they demanded the assembly act swiftly to reassert control. For ordinary citizens watching from countless worlds, it was something entirely different. They saw that the so-called dangerous humans had not answered chains with fire or massacres, but with a strange mercy that revealed strength without cruelty. Families whispered late into the night, wondering if perhaps the stories told of Earth had been lies. Elias Rowan sat within the command cavern under the moon and monitored the shifting tides. Aegis ships moved like shadows through hidden lanes, always close enough to guard Earth but never yet leaving Sol. They were waiting for the choice of others to be made. Humans had learned through hard centuries that sometimes the most powerful act was not striking first but standing still and letting arrogance fall into its own trap. He did not celebrate each captured fleet, though others around him cheered. He carried the weight of knowing that this was only the beginning, and soon greater powers would test the boundaries. Far away in the corridors of the assembly, the silver-eyed aide began to uncover whispers more dangerous than she had expected. Her master was deep in arguments with the cartel agents who had bribed him. Their voices were sharp with panic, for they had invested fortunes in the future trade of human labor and now saw their empire collapse in real time. She listened quietly as they blamed one another, and in their fury they revealed pieces of a larger puzzle. The vote had not simply been fear of Earth. It had been engineered by those who thrived on chains. She understood then that the assembly was not the true power. It was only the stage where actors performed while the cartel pulled strings from the shadows. Her name was Lyra, and until now no one had ever asked it. She was born into servitude, her family bound by old debts to her master's house. She had been taught to keep her head down and her mouth closed. But the look Elias Rowan had given her during the vote stayed with her. It had told her that even the smallest voice mattered, and she began to believe she could use hers. She started copying fragments of data onto her own hidden sticks. Reports of bribes, records of secret meetings, the names of guild masters who had profited from centuries of suffering. Each night she carried her burden quietly in her robe and told herself she was only a servant. Yet with each stolen record she felt more like a witness. The slaver guilds tried a different tactic. If they could not break Sol directly, they would strike Earth's outposts and allies. A flotilla descended on a small mining colony, run jointly by humans and a gentle avian species. The raiders expected terror, but instead found their ships surrounded by nets of pale lattice that stretched across space like the threads of some vast spider. Their engines went still, their weapons cold, and their hulls guided gently to a safe orbit. On the colony surface, miners watched in stunned silence as the warships that had come to enslave them were placed harmlessly overhead like ornaments. Then, Aegis drones descended not with weapons but with supplies, rebuilding machines, and medical aid. Messages were broadcast in every tongue. Humanity does not come to conquer. Humanity comes to guard. Release your chains and live. For many across the galaxy, it was a moment that shook their hearts. They had expected Earth to seek vengeance, yet instead, they saw protection given freely. Species that had never dared speak against slavery now found courage in whispers. The question spread from street to street and world to world. If humans who had been marked for chains could still show mercy, Then what excuse did the rest of the galaxy have for silence, Elias? Rowan read these reports with heavy eyes. He knew change was never born without blood, and he feared what would happen when the cartel struck back with all its might. Still, he allowed the fleet to hold steady. Each act of mercy struck deeper than any bombardment could. The image of captured warships sitting harmless under starlight was more powerful than fire. He knew the galaxy was beginning to see Earth not as prey, but as something older and stronger, something that had walked through fire and chosen not to burn others. He whispered to the fleet that they must hold the line a little longer because the tide was beginning to turn. In the assembly, some delegates began to tremble as evidence of corruption leaked in whispers. Through the halls, Lyra passed information carefully to those who dared to question the vote. Fear grew in the eyes of powerful men and women who had thought their secrets safe. And still Aegis stood in silence, capturing fleets but spilling no blood. The galaxy had always believed strength was measured by who could kill the fastest. Now they were beginning to learn there was another kind of strength, one that made even the guilty begin to plead before the sentence had been spoken. The galaxy was restless, and the assembly felt it with every passing day, as fear turned into something heavier than fear-shame. Whole populations began to question why their leaders had voted to enslave Earth, and why they had followed the slaver guilds into a decision that now looked monstrous when reflected in the light of human restraint. News broadcasts, once filled with pride at the assembly's unity, now struggled to defend the choice, and more often than not avoided the subject altogether. Yet whispers spread through the streets of great cities on distant worlds, whispers that humanity had drawn a boundary around itself and then chosen mercy rather than vengeance. Those whispers grew into protests, and for the first time in centuries, the slaver guilds found themselves hunted by the voices of their own people. Lyra moved like a ghost through the assembly halls, carrying data sticks hidden in her robe and recording fragments of arguments and bribes. She had grown up believing her life would never matter, and yet now every step she took carried the weight of change. She passed the files to delegates who still held honor, and each new piece of evidence deepened the cracks in the assembly's walls. She knew the cartel was searching for leaks and that if they discovered her, she would be silenced. But the look Elias Rowan had given her remained like a flame guiding her through the dark. Each night she whispered her name to herself as if reminding the universe she existed not as property but as a voice out in the void. The Aegis fleet continued to answer every act of aggression with the same pattern of mercy and power. A group of slaver lords sent their fastest assault ships toward a refugee convoy, hoping to seize captives before Aegis could respond. But when their ships crossed the invisible boundary, they froze in silence, held gently by threads of lattice that wrapped around them without harm. The refugees watched from their transports as the same warships that had promised to drag them into chains were instead lowered carefully to safe orbit and disarmed without a single shot fired. Supplies were delivered to the convoy, and the children among them played under banners of Earth they had once been told to fear. Word of this spread faster than any decree from the assembly. For every voice of hate raised against Earth, 100 more voices rose to say, perhaps humans were different. Elias Rowan stood with his hand pressed against the glass of the command cradle and listened to reports. He felt the weight of history pressing against his shoulders, for he knew mercy could only hold so long before blood would be demanded. Yet he held to the path humanity had chosen. Aegis was not built to conquer. It was built to guard and to show that strength need not mean cruelty. Each captured fleet was returned once its prisoners were released and its chains destroyed. Each act of mercy carved deeper into the arrogance of those who profited from suffering. He knew the cartel was preparing something larger, for predators did not yield easily when their power was threatened. The assembly grew louder with every day of silence from the cartel. Guildmasters shouted that Aegis must be destroyed, and they begged for allied fleets to gather for war. Yet none volunteered quickly, for every admiral had seen the images of captured warships stacked like toys, and none wished to risk their name against such power. Delegates who had once cheered the enslavement of Earth now avoided the subject, and some even tried to erase their recorded votes, though the evidence of corruption made such attempts useless. Lyra's stolen files began to reach media channels, and though the cartel tried to silence them, too many had already seen. For the first time in centuries, truth moved faster than fear. on a distant world where slaver rule had been absolute. A crowd filled the streets and toppled the banners of their masters, shouting that if humans could stand against chains, so could they. Across the galaxy, sparks of rebellion began to ignite not through weapons but through voices. And every voice carried the same question: if Earth, with all its scars, could choose mercy, why had the rest of the galaxy chosen cruelty? Still Elias knew this tide could not flow forever without collision. He gathered his captains in the moon caverns and spoke to them plainly. He told them the cartel would strike soon, not with small raids but with something larger, something meant to break Aegis and restore fear. He told them they must hold true to their oath not to kill unless no choice remained, for the power of mercy was their greatest weapon. His captains nodded, each one knowing that the days ahead would test not only their strength but their souls. The galaxy had voted to enslave Earth, but now more and more voices began to say that it was the galaxy itself that stood on trial. And every act of mercy from Aegis was another piece of evidence that the Assembly had chosen wrong. The plea for mercy would come soon, Elias knew. But before that day, the cartel would unleash its teeth and the true measure of Aegis would be revealed. The first desperate pleas reached the Assembly not from slaver guilds, but from the very worlds that had once voted so confidently for Earth's enslavement. Leaders who had raised their hands in favor of chains now sent envoys bearing messages of regret. They spoke of food shortages and unrest on their streets. They spoke of ships that never returned, and merchants who could no longer move their goods. They begged for mercy not from the Assembly but from the humans they had condemned. It was a humiliation that spread across the galaxy like a sickness, and each plea was another stone thrown into the foundation of the cartel's power. Still, the cartel tightened its grip and promised their followers that Aegis could not stand against the full force of their fleets. Yet fear whispered louder than promises. Lyra walked the corridors of the Assembly with her head bowed and her robe heavy with secrets. Every night she added more names and more numbers to her growing archive of corruption. She began to pass them not only to delegates but to journalists, who dared to risk their lives to broadcast truth. One such broadcast showed the names of 20 counselors who had accepted bribes to vote for Earth's enslavement. The feed ran for less than an hour before it was cut, but the names were already etched into the minds of billions. On distant worlds, statues of those counselors were torn down in the streets and families spat upon their faces. Lyra felt fear coil around her throat with every step, but she also felt the weight of something greater. She was no longer invisible. She was a blade of truth cutting through lies. Meanwhile, Aegis expanded its reach not with conquest, but with compassion. A human rescue fleet arrived at a famine world whose rulers had voted to enslave Earth. Their warehouses were empty, and their people starving, yet instead of vengeance, the humans landed with supplies. Grain spilled from their holds, water flowed from their tanks, and medical drones worked through the night. The sight of humans feeding the children of a world that had condemned them struck the galaxy like a thunderclap. Fear began to turn into shame and shame into doubt. Crowds gathered around the landing sites chanting in languages humans did not understand, but the meaning was clear. They were grateful. They had been lied to. Elias Rowan listened to the reports with weary eyes. He knew mercy was the sharpest weapon, but he also knew mercy could break the hearts of his own people. Many on Earth cried out for justice, for retribution, for vengeance upon those who had sought to chain them. Elias carried their voices with him, but he believed the galaxy could only change if humanity proved there was another way. Aegis did not exist to conquer stars. It existed to show them a mirror of what they had become and what they could choose instead. The cartel sensed its grip loosening. Desperate, it sent assassins into the Assembly to silence the voices rising against them. Several delegates were found dead in their chambers, their data cores destroyed. Panic spread among those who had once thought themselves untouchable. Yet the killings only deepened the anger of the people. When Lyra's leaks continued even after the murders, it became clear the cartel could not kill truth fast enough. She hid in plain sight, a servant walking silently through halls filled with fear, carrying a storm in her hands. Across the stars, species once broken by slavery began to send signals to Aegis. Some offered to fight, others simply asked for protection. Elias read every request and answered the same way. Aegis would not conquer, but it would guard. Wherever chains were broken, humanity would stand watch. The slaver guilds howled at this open defiance, but their voices sounded smaller, now drowned by the cries of the people they had long ignored. In the great cities of the galaxy, banners once raised in pride of the Assembly's vote were burned in the streets. Crowds carried images of captured warships turned harmless under the pale webs of Aegis. They shouted that mercy was stronger than chains. They shouted that Earth had shown the galaxy its own face. And in the quiet of his command cradle, Elias whispered to himself that the pleas for mercy had only begun. Soon the Assembly itself would kneel and the cartel would reveal its last weapon. He did not know if mercy alone could withstand what was coming, but he was ready to try, because for the first time the galaxy was beginning to believe that humanity was not prey but a judge with hands that held both strength and compassion. The cartel had been silent too long, and when their silence finally broke, it came like a storm. From the edge of the galaxy, near a dead star where no light reached, they gathered their hidden armada. These were not the fleets the Assembly had counted in open records. These were ships built in secret yards with funds stolen from generations of chained labor. They were cruel vessels sharpened into weapons meant for one purpose, only to shatter Aegis and to remind the galaxy that the slavers were still masters. Their admirals swore before their crews that humanity would be broken in fire. They promised their followers that mercy would burn away before the first broadside. They moved with quiet fury toward Saul, believing no web could hold against such numbers. Elias Rowan felt the weight of their coming before any sensor confirmed it. Aegis vessels whispered through their shared networks, and the pattern of the stars changed like breath held too long. He called his captains to stand in the cavern beneath the moon and told them the truth. This would not be like the raids or the assaults that Aegis had met before. This would be the test of the entire dream they had built. If they held true, then mercy would triumph. If they failed, the galaxy would return to chains for 1,000 years. His voice did not rise into anger, but it carried a calm strength that spread into every soul who heard it. His captains placed their hands on the glass of the command cradles and swore they would hold. Lyra moved in the shadows of the Assembly as the cartel prepared its strike. Her latest leaks had spread far and wide, and she knew her name was whispered now, though no one dared speak it aloud in public. She had stolen enough to bury dozens of leaders and expose the cartel's web of control. But she understood that information alone would not save them if Aegis fell. So she made a choice. She slipped through corridors meant for servants and made her way to the hidden chambers where the Assembly's private feeds linked to the galaxy. She would not remain silent any longer. When the moment came, she would step into the light and speak. The cartel armada arrived at the dead star, first believing they could ambush the Aegis fleet before it could form its defenses. But when their ships emerged from slipstream, they found themselves already inside a vast lattice that unfolded from the gravity wells of the star itself. Pale threads of force stretched from horizon to horizon, bending their sensors and choking their engines. They tried to fire, and their weapons grew cold. They tried to flee, and their drives spun without answer. For the first time, the slaver admirals felt what countless prisoners had felt under their rule, complete helplessness. Elias Rowan's voice filled their command decks, calm and steady. He told them their fleets were bound, but their crews were unharmed. He told them there was still a path if they surrendered their chains and released their captives. The admirals raged and swore death, but their crews listened with wide eyes. Many had been pressed into service by the guilds. Many had families hidden under debt. When they realized Aegis was offering life instead of destruction, whispers spread among the ranks. Mutiny broke like wildfire. Entire ships turned their guns inward, not against Aegis, but against their own masters. The web of the cartel began to unravel, not from without, but from within. At the same time, in the assembly chamber, chaos broke loose as Lyra stepped forward carrying a single data stick. She moved to the speaking stone, trembling but unbroken. Her voice was not loud, but it carried through the hall as she read the names of those who had been bought and the payments they had taken. She read the orders that had come not from the assembly, but from the cartel. She told the galaxy that the vote to enslave Earth had been nothing more than a purchase made in the currency of suffering. Delegates shouted for guards, but by then, the feeds had already carried her words across every world. Billions watched as the quiet servant no one had seen before tore the mask from the assembly's face. Elias felt the moment of fracture ripple through the networks of the galaxy. The cartel admirals who had sworn to shatter humanity now found themselves betrayed by their own crews and exposed by their own secrets. Aegis did not fire a single shot of lethal force, and yet the greatest shadow power in the galaxy began to collapse. Ships surrendered one after another, and chains were cut both in space and in the minds of those who had lived too long under fear. Mercy had teeth sharper than any blade, and now the galaxy understood it. Lyra stood at the stone surrounded by chaos, but she felt lighter than she ever had. She had spoken her truth, and she knew even if they dragged her away, she had already changed the course of history. Across the chamber, voices rose not in defense of the cartel, but in demands for justice. And through the feed, millions of beings whispered her name as if it were a signal of dawn. The age of chains was ending, and the plea for mercy was becoming a chorus the galaxy could no longer ignore. The assembly chamber had never been so quiet. The bowl-shaped hall that once thundered with applause at the decision to enslave Earth now lay frozen as if every voice had been cut away. The speaker sat pale and trembling, his hands shaking on the table before him. Around him, delegates avoided one another's eyes, for the truth had already spread beyond walls and feeds. The galaxy knew the vote had been bought. The galaxy knew the cartel had ruled them with chains, and the galaxy had seen those chains snapped without bloodshed by a fleet that should never have existed. It was no longer Earth that stood on trial, it was them. And no speech could hide it. Lyra stood at the speaking stone, still clutching the small data stick that had carried so much weight. Guards had tried to move toward her, but the crowd within the chamber had risen first. Delegates from minor worlds blocked the path, their voices sharp with fear but also with defiance. They demanded she be heard, and so she had been heard across 1,000 systems. Now she stood silent, her chest heaving but her eyes clear. She had been invisible all her life, and now her face was known everywhere. No chains bound her now, for she had broken them with words. Elias Rowan appeared not in person, but as a projection above the chamber. His figure hovered calm and steady, the same plain suit and the same quiet eyes that had delivered the warning weeks before. He did not raise his voice, and yet every ear strained to hear him. He told the assembly that humanity had no desire to conquer, no wish to enslave, no dream of empire. He said Earth had built Aegis not to rule but to protect, because humanity had once tasted chains and vowed never to forge them for others. He said the galaxy had a choice to make, and that choice would shape ages to come. They could cling to the cartel's cruelty and drown in shame, or they could walk a harder road, one built on mercy and truth. The decision was not Earth's to make, it was theirs. The speaker tried to interrupt, but his words collapsed under the weight of the silence. Other delegates rose instead. Some demanded amnesty for themselves, others demanded trials, and still more called out in grief, confessing their part in the vote. The chamber shook with argument, but outside the voices of ordinary beings were louder still. Cities filled with protest banners demanding freedom not just for humans, but for all who had been bound. On mining colonies, slaves rose against their masters. On distant stations, workers threw down tools and refused to serve. A tide had begun, and even the assembly could not hold it back. The cartel's remaining fleets surrendered one by one, their admirals dragged down by mutiny or by despair. Aegis guided the ships to neutral ground, stripped of chains and weapons, but not of life. For every captive freed, a signal was sent across the stars reading only, "These are yours again. Care for them." Such messages struck deeper than any sword. They were reminders of what had been stolen and what could be restored. Lyra was offered protection by human envoys, but she refused to leave the assembly. She said her place was here among the ruins of the old order, to make sure the truth was never buried again. She became the voice that carried the names of freed species into the record of history. Every session she rose and read aloud lists that seemed endless. Names of peoples broken and scattered, now rising again. She spoke until her voice cracked, but she never stopped, because she knew every name mattered. And every time she spoke, the delegates listened, not because they wished to, but because they had no choice. The galaxy listened with them, and slowly shame began to turn into something like hope. Elias Rowan returned to Earth, where crowds greeted him not with celebration, but with quiet respect. He walked among them as an ordinary man, not a conqueror. He told them that the fight was not over, that mercy would be tested again and again. Yet he also told them that they had changed the stars forever. They had shown a galaxy addicted to chains that strength could mean something else. And though enemies would remain and shadows would linger, humanity had carved its place not as prey and not as tyrant, but as guardian. In the years that followed, the assembly reformed under pressure from its own people. The slaver guilds were dissolved, their wealth broken apart and given back to the worlds they had drained. Trials were held, and some of the most corrupt were judged not by vengeance but by law. It was a slow and painful rebirth, but it began with the moment a servant spoke and a human envoy reminded the stars of mercy. That memory became the cornerstone of a new era. And so when the galaxy looked back, they did not remember the vote that enslaved Earth. They remembered the day mercy stood before chains and chains shattered. They remembered the fleets caught in webs of light. They remembered a servant with silver eyes who spoke truth to power. And they remembered that when every species pleaded for mercy, it was Earth that answered with a steady voice and an open hand. Changed, and nothing would ever be the same again. Every system, every planet, every life felt the echoes of what had happened. The vote to enslave Earth had been a moment of arrogance, a moment of cruelty, a moment that had united humanity in a way no one could have imagined. The fleets that had threatened worlds now drifted in neutral space under the watchful eyes of human sentinels, who carried no weapons but authority, and a warning that chains were no longer tolerated. Lyra walked among the delegates not as a conqueror, but as a witness, her voice, carrying stories of those who had suffered and those who had survived. She spoke of hope and resilience, of the courage of ordinary beings who had stood against tyranny. She told of miners who had risen from their cages of metal and dust, of scholars who had rebuilt libraries lost in wars, and of children who had learned to sing again under skies that had been dark. With fear, Elias Rowan moved through cities that had once trembled at the mention of Earth and found them alive with energy, with life, with the quiet determination of those who understood that freedom came at a cost. He met with leaders of alien worlds not to demand, but to counsel, not to threaten, but to guide. He reminded them that mercy was not weakness, and that strength could be measured not by fear, but by the willingness to protect and forgive. The assembly had reformed its laws, but it was the memory of humanity that enforced them, for when the galaxy saw a species capable of bending chains without breaking bones, they knew that there was a new order, a new reckoning. Trade routes reopened slowly but carefully, for some species had scars that would not fade, and some systems whispered of revenge and old grudges, yet humans continued to travel among them, carrying aid, carrying knowledge, and carrying warnings of the past. They taught that cooperation was stronger than domination, and that the small acts of kindness could echo across light years faster than any warship could fire. Aegis continued its patrols not as an army, but as a reminder that justice could be swift and fair, and that no one was too small to demand respect. Lyra eventually stood on a balcony overlooking a city where humans and aliens lived side by side, where markets thrived with goods from distant worlds, and where children of all species played under the same sun. She thought of the assembly and the voices that had once demanded her silence. She remembered the fear in their eyes, the desperation in their voices. And she smiled, knowing that they had learned that humanity was not to be underestimated. They had voted to enslave, and they had failed. They had begged for mercy, and they had found it, not in weakness, but in the power of humanity to rise above hatred, and in the quiet hours of the night, when the stars stretched endlessly across the sky, she looked up and felt the pulse of countless worlds connected by a single truth that had traveled faster than any warship, faster than any message, faster than any law. The truth that strength without cruelty could change everything. The truth that even the smallest voice could shape the fate of empires. The truth that Earth would never kneel and would never bow, but would always stand ready to show mercy and demand respect. The galaxy had learned a lesson it would never forget: the end